Assalamu alaikum. In this video, we will see the different methods that we can use to create config maps in Kubernetes. So config maps are Kubernetes objects that we can use to store configuration data. So instead of hard coding the configuration needed for an application in the application code itself, we can decouple it from the application code and store it in config map. And then we can inject the config maps to the pods or the containers that need this configuration. In this video, we will see how we can create config maps, and in the next video, we will see how we can inject them as a volume or to populate some environment variables for a container. There are some points that we have to know about config maps. So first of all, config maps store the data as a key value pairs. And you should know that config maps are not designed to store sensitive data like passwords, okay? For storing sensitive data, we have another object in Kubernetes, which is the secret object. And finally, you should know that config maps must be created before referencing them in pods. So to create config maps, we have two methods. Either we can use the imperative method using directly the kubectl command, or the declarative method by creating YAML file and then applying them using the kubectl command. So first of all, let's see how we can create config maps using the imperative method. So for that, we're going to use the kubectl command and then create. After create, we should specify the object type, which is config map, and then we give a name to our config map. And after the name, if we will create a config map using a file, so here we're going to use the from file option, and we set it to the path to the file. So here we have the path to that file. So the file that contains the configuration data needed to create the config map. So for example, if we want to create a config map using this configuration file, so here we have a file that contains some configuration data. If we want to create a config map using this file, here we set the from file option to the path to this file, okay? The same thing if we have a folder containing some files containing the configuration data. So for example, here we have a folder, and here we have two files that store some configuration. So here we have game.properties. Here we have some data. The same thing for the UI.properties. So in this folder, we have two files containing some configuration data. If we want to create a config map using the file stored here in this folder, here we should specify the path to the directory containing this file, okay? We can also create config maps using key value pairs. For that, we use the from literal option. So here we use the from literal option, and then we have the name of the key that we want to store in this config map, and we set the key to the value. So if you want to create a config map directly using key value pairs, here we should use the from literal option, and we give it the key, and then we give it the value. So let's see first of all how we can create config maps using a directory containing files that store the configuration data. For that, we use the kubectl command, kubectl create config map. Then we give a name to this config map. So I'm gonna call it game config. So this is the name of the config map, and then we're gonna use the from file option, because here we're gonna use a directory that contains some files that store the configuration data. So here we give the from file option the path to the directory. So this is the path to the directory containing the files that store the configuration data. Now let's press enter. Here it tells us that the config map is successfully created. If you want to display all the config maps that you have, so we can use kubectl get config maps. So here we have two config maps, and here we have the game config map that we create using this command. Okay, if you want to get the description of this config map in YAML format, you can use kubectl get config map, and then we give it the name of the config map, which is game config, with the YAML option. So here is the description of the config map in a YAML format. So here we have the API version v1. Here we have the data stored in this config map. This data comes from these two files. Okay, so here we have enemies equal aliens. This is coming from the game.properties. So all of this data is coming from this file. Okay, the same thing for the UI.properties. So here we have this data. This data is coming from the UI.properties file. Here the kind is config map because it is a config map object. So this is how we can create config map using a directory that contains file that store the configuration data. Now let's see how we can create a config map using a specific file. So here in this directory, we have a file called Redis config. This file contains this data. We're gonna see how we can create a config maps using this file. For that, here we're gonna use again the kubectl create config map. Then I'm gonna call this config map Redis config. Then we set the from file option to the path to this file, okay, which is Redis config. Okay, so here we have to set the from file option to the name of this directory combined with the name of this file. So here is the path to this Redis config file. Now let's press enter. Here it tells us that the Redis config map was created. Let's display the config maps that we have. So kubectl get config maps. So now we have 3 config maps. Here is the Redis config created using this command. Let's get the description of this config map in YAML format. So here we have Redis config. So here is the description of the Redis config map in YAML format. Here in the data section, we have Redis config, which is the name of this file. And then we have the data stored in this Redis config file. Okay, so that's how we can create a config map using a specific file. Now let's see how we can create a config map using key value pairs. So for that we use kubectl create config map, and then we give a name to this config map. For example, I'm gonna call it app config. And now instead of using the from file option, we're gonna use the from literal option. We set the from literal option to the key that we want to use, followed by the value of this key. So for example, if you want to have a key called username, so this is the name of the key, and then I'm gonna set it to my name, for example, which is Wissam. Okay, so here we will create a config map called appconfig, and in this config map we will store username, key, and we give this key a value which is vsem. Okay, so let's press enter. Here the config map was created. Now if we display all the config maps that we have, so now we have 4 config maps. Let's get the description of the last config map in YAML format, which is called appconfig. So now if we go to the data section, here we have username, which is the key, and vsem, which is the value given to this key. Okay, so here kind is config map. This is the type of the Kubernetes object. Name is appconfig, so this is the name of the config map. Okay, so this is how we can create config maps using the imperative method. Now let's see how we can create config maps using the declarative method, so using a YAML file. So here in this folder, I'm going to create a YAML file. I'm going to call it my app configmap.yaml. So here, like all the Kubernetes object, first of all, we have to set the API version. So here we have v1. So the kind is the type of the Kubernetes object that we want to create. So here we will create a config map. Then in the metadata section, we give a name to our Kubernetes object. I'm gonna call it my app config map. And after the metadata section, instead of having the spec section, here we have the data section. In the data section here, we will pass the configuration data that we want to store in this config map. For example, here, if I want to store username, and I'm gonna give it the value, for example, John, and you can add any other data that you want to store in this config map. Okay, so this is the structure of a YAML file used to create config maps. So you should know that instead of having the spec section, here we have a data section, and in the data section here we pass the data that we want to store in this config map. So now let's use this YAML file to create a config map. For that we will use the kubectl create -f, and then we give it the name of the YAML file. Here the YAML file is called my app config map. .yaml. So let's press enter. Here it tells us that the config map is successfully created. Now let's display all the config maps that we have. So now we have 5 config maps. We have here the my app config map. So this is the last config map created using this YAML file. If we get the description of this config map in YAML format, so let's do that using this command, kubectl get config map, and then we give it the name of the config map, which is my app config map. So here is the description of this config map. So here, if we go on the bottom, we find the name of the config map, which is my app config. And here is the data section. In the data section, we have the key username with the John value, okay, as we set it here in the YAML file. Okay, so that's how we can create config map using the declarative method. The last thing that we're gonna see here is how to delete config map. So here, if we list all the config maps, we have 5 config maps. To delete the config map, simply we can use the command kubectl delete config map, and then we specify the name of the config map. For example, if we want to delete this app config, so here we pass the name of this config map. So the config map was deleted. Let's verify that using kubectl get config maps. Now we see that the app config disappears. And if you create a config map using a YAML file, you can also delete this config map using this command kubectl delete, and then we give it the name of the YAML file used to create this config map. So if we want to delete this config map, here we will pass the name of the YAML file used to create this config map to this command. So kubectl delete -f, and then the name of this file, which is my app configmap.yaml. So here it tells us that my app config map was deleted. If we list the config maps that we have, now we have only 3 config maps, and the my app config map disappears. Okay, so that's how we can create config maps in Kubernetes. I hope that is clear, and in the next video we will see how we can use config maps as a volume, or how we can use them to populate environment variables in a container. So I hope everything is clear, and thank you.